Architecture across time has been granted change. Change in theories, philosophies, design styles, materials, and technologies have all intersected to create a complex web of today's design practice. In the context of our current time, focus has shifted and created a new movement in architecture, one of design leadership, with social awareness, ethical practices, and work towards equity and inclusion for all individuals in the built environment. Today, we will be exploring the evolution of the LGBT+ rights movement. To start with, let's give some background on the movement itself. In the United States, the LGBT+ rights movement came into the limelight in post-war, late 1960s America, in the context of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This victory for the civil rights movement catapulted the gay rights movement into the public eye, as queer individuals asked the question, what about sexual orientation? Some important moments from queer history include the Stonewall Riots on June 28, 1969, which brought LGBT+ spaces, people, and identities into the public. Increased media and celebrity queer representation in the 21st century. And finally, June 2015's Obergefell versus Hodges, where the United States Supreme Court ruled same-sex marriage legal.
Even with many victories for the LGBT+ rights movement throughout the past 20 years, queer rights still hang in the balance of politicians and continuously discerning individuals. In recent times, it has become even more important to consider intersectionality when talking about gay rights, as different identities within the community face different levels of discrimination, and identities outside of the LGBT+ umbrella also further complicate matters. For example, transgender people of color face statistically higher amounts of hate crimes and violence towards them than other individuals in the community. Recognizing this, along with today's anti-queer practices, is crucial towards further equality. In today's political practice, LGBT+ rights are still in question for many individuals, and the problems are much more complex than simply marriage equality. During Donald Trump's 2016-2020 presidency, work continued against the queer community. Opposition to the Equality Act, which guaranteed non-discrimination protections for LGBT+ people, employment discrimination against LGBT+ people, a ban on transgender service members from the military, and rolling back Obama-era non-discrimination protections, along with other discriminatory actions. Many of these actions were reversed within the first few weeks of Joe Biden's administration in 2021, but this shows that LGBT+ rights are still in debate. Additionally, the 2015 Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida, killing 49 people, reminds us that violence against the LGBT+ community is far from over.
Looking across different scales and times, historical, large-scale, or local, 3 different projects we have chosen can help trace the development of the LGBT+ rights movement into the manifestation of architecture. One of these projects that have created change is Studio 54 in New York City. Studio 54 was designed by Eugene DeRosa in 1927. In the 1970s, Studio 54 was recognized by the queer community as a safe space. In pop culture, the studio was the focal point for art, theater, fashion, and a cultural haven for the LGBT+ community. This space offered safety and inclusion for musicians, designers, and the queer public. Creating inclusive places is something the architecture profession can learn from historical precedents like Studio 54. Moving on to the large-scale recent project, the LGBT+ Center in Los Angeles is a utopia for the gay community. This is evident in architecture by the number of social spaces that are located throughout the building. The program is complex and varying to allow for multifaceted programs all supporting the queer community. The courtyards puncture the space and make safe, enclosed but open-air spaces to those inside, seeking refuge from the potentially harmful public. These courtyards allow for a sense of liberation, but also protection for those inside. These spaces create conceptual inclusion and focus on awareness of the needs of the LGBT plus community, which architects Leong and KFA help lead design in this focus. Finally, looking within the city of Albuquerque, queer architecture has manifested in unexpected places. The first Congregational Church of Albuquerque was founded in February of 2001 with the goal of being an LGBT plus affirming religious organization. Steps away from UNM, an installation created for the church sparked debate within the Albuquerque area, with a series of rainbow-painted doors reading, "God's doors are open to all." Spaces that promote conversation like the First Congregational Church of Albuquerque help draw and promote visibility and discussion on important topics such as the LGBT plus people and the historic exclusion from religion. Even within our local area, the LGBT plus rights have manifested in architecture to provoke debate and create acceptance and change for the queer community.
Within the design community, some LGBTQ design leaders are A.L. who is a queer non-binary designer of color who works to increase gender equality within the architectural field. Design as a Protest Collective, the online group Queries, which is an ongoing survey of architects and designers who identify as LGBTQ, facilitate discussions. The responses and stories are then posted to help better understand a wider range of experiences of queer architects and designers today. Another leader is Adam Nathaniel Furman, who altered a design style to represent non-binary through gender-inclusive color palettes. These colors include a variety of bright blue, pink, purple, green, and yellow. As it distills into the architectural profession, the American Institute of Architecture has started to bring LGBTQ inclusion into the conversation. In 2019, the AIA held a panel for LGBTQ voices for their conference on architecture. During this conference, 4 design professionals who identify as queer were speaking about discrimination, inclusion, the work environment, and their ideas on creating equality through conversation, education, and awareness.
Whether we agree with their agenda or not, social movements have surrounded our cultural sphere for centuries. The LGBT plus rights movement, with its progression into further and further adoption by society, has gained equal representation and concern within the design profession. Architects focusing on social issues is not a new concept per se, but design leadership and taking hold of these movements to create better spaces for everyone has started to become a new standard within the architectural profession. So, we invite you to think about this social movement, or others, or even your own identity, and how that would affect how space is important to you. Every person's identity is unique, but trying to adapt spaces to the unique overarching identities and concerns of the community is increasingly important for design. Without awareness for the people who inhabit a building, without concern or equality, what kinds of spaces are we creating as architects? How are we harming individuals or excluding them? The history, architectural examples, and current state of the LGBT plus rights movement should provide clarity on how inclusive spaces make for good architectural design and practice.